Good evening, everybody. We're going to start with a small but mighty group with class number 3. I'm going to put into the chat our there we go. This is our handout for tonight, and so those in the studio audience can go ahead. Actually, the studio audience, sorry, has a copy already. Those online can go ahead and click on that and download it. You will definitely need that tonight. I will be projecting on the screen, as always, the pages that we're looking at, but there will be a reading at the end that you will need, that we're not going to do, or I won't be reading out loud, and so you'll need a copy of this in order to do the reading. So go ahead and you can download that, and I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So. All right. Okay. The name of tonight's class is Jews in the Civil Rights Movement, Critical Bechira Points. So the Mussar concept of tonight is going to be the concept of Bechira point, and we're going to get to that about midway through our lesson. And the content of our class tonight is going to be Jews in the Civil Rights Movement, and we're going to be looking at that actually in 2 chapters. Chapter 1, we're going to be looking at the Civil Rights Movement through the eyes of education, from Brown versus Board of Education, and the desegregation movements in the 1950s and 60s, and where do the Jews fit into that. And then we're going to look at Jews who, and actually I should finish that first part of the story in chapter 1. Much of the desegregation story that takes place both in the South End and also in the North entails Jews leaving their previous urban settings. And this is true nationally. As we know, here in Boston, Roxbury and Dorchester had been predominantly not predominantly Jewish, but a lot of the Jewish community, white Jewish community, lived in Dorchester and Roxbury. And by the end of the 60s, early 70s, the vast majority of those communities had moved to the suburbs like Brookline, Newton, Lexington, Wellesley, and beyond. So that'll be the first chapter that we look at. And then the second is really going to be about Jewish communities around that time, white Jewish communities that lived with and alongside non-Jewish Blacks in places like Harlem. And we're going to look at that through the eyes of James Baldwin, and that is really going to be a test of a lot of the Mussar that we've been looking at. So that would be the second half of what we do together. So without further ado, okay, welcome to our most recent guest. Hang on for 1 second. I'm going to put into the chat our Irene, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I put the today's handout is in the chat, so you can download that. Okay, so we're going to get started now with a very quick review on page 2. So just to look very quickly at the two Mussar concepts that we've been looking at over the past 2 weeks, because I want to really employ them in our lesson today. So the first one is Hitlamdut, the concept that we should always be reflecting on what we are encountering in the world. Sometimes we encounter things that are shocking to us, that are upsetting to us, that push our buttons, trigger, whatever word you want to use. And at that point, we have a choice. We can either choose to allow it to upset us or push our buttons, or we can engage in reflection. What was going on in this moment that made me respond this way? What can I learn from that? How can I take this experience and, instead of me responding negatively or destructively, instead next time respond positively and constructively? So that really is the concept of Hitlamdut. It also encompasses when we encounter things that we already know or we think we know already. Do we want to engage in that by saying, I'm bored, I know about this already? Or do we want to say, what new can I learn from this? What experiences that I've had can I bring to this learning that might help to broaden my experience right now, rather than sitting here and saying, I know all this already. So that would be another form of hitlamdut. Welcome, Shimon. In the chat, there is you can download today's handout. Okay. The second concept on page 3. We spent a little time looking at the quotes and thinking last week about which quotes were most meaningful. I've pared them down a little bit, just to remind ourselves of what the basic ideas were. The second idea is achrayut, that once we have engaged in hitlamdut, once we have really thought about what it is that we are experiencing, what we're learning, etc., we then should be asking ourselves, do I have responsibility in this moment to do something about what I've just learned? A responsibility to, again, not to fix the whole problem, we can't, not to solve the entire problem, it's not possible. Rather, what role can I play? What good can I do in a productive, healthy way that will help to move the needle a little bit forward, which is really all we can ever do. So the question is, what does it mean to be a person who really engages with achrayut? And for me, the quote at the very bottom from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, not only sums up the concept of responsibility or achrayut, but I think in many ways our class as a whole. And he says, morally speaking, there is no limit to the concern one must feel for the suffering of human beings, that indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And here's the key, that in a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And again, just to remind ourselves, none of us are here saying that we are guilty of having caused the problems that we are learning about here. But we do not want people to feel shame. We do not want people to feel paralyzed by feelings of horror for what has happened, but rather that people leave with this feeling of responsibility. I need to be doing something that we are all responsible for. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get into our class for today. So if we'll all turn now to page 5. Okay, so I'm going to leave this open on page 5. This is, I'll just very quickly frame this and I'll have everybody read. So this was one of the most famous cases to ever come before the United States Supreme Court. It involved actually several different plaintiffs, several different people bringing the cases to the Supreme Court. They were all families of students, Black students who are in K through 12 schools throughout the country. And the argument that they made, and this is a really important argument, was not that the Black schools were inherently inferior to the white schools. In fact, they even conceded in many, many places, the Black schools actually are getting better. They are improving. They are adding, more teachers. They're updating the books.
I would mention also with that, because there was no higher education beyond college, there were segregated all Black schools, all Black colleges in the South, but there were no higher education programs. So if you wanted to get, for example, a master's degree, the state you lived in would pay for you to go to a northern college and get a master's degree. Came back to the South because no northern school would hire Black teachers. And so the Black schools in the South, very often the teachers were very highly educated individuals. And so there was an actual benefit to Black children in the South, because many of those schools, despite the physical plant being really terrible and the books being in bad shape, the teachers were very often very well educated. And in fact, later on, the integration of the public schools takes away the jobs of a lot of those Black teachers.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Well, the irony is not an interruption at all. It's very important. And one of the key strategies of the NAACP was to not make the argument the most probably famous argument about segregation is that the white facility was always nicer than the black facility. And in most cases that was true, but they said that's not the argument we're going to make. We're going to make a very different argument. And so I think the Supreme Court in its ruling spells it out, and I think it's captured in this excerpt. And so I'm going to ask everybody to take a moment, read the excerpt from the Supreme Court's ruling. What is the argument that they're making? And then I'd love to hear your responses and thoughts about the Supreme Court's ruling here in Brown versus Board of Education. So go ahead and read these paragraphs. Okay. Hear responses, thoughts about, or we can actually start with clarifying questions. Are there clarifying questions about this? And then we can move to thoughts about what the Supreme Court had to say here in 1954. Anything you notice? And again, people are free to either speak their responses or put them into the chat, whichever they prefer.
Well, can I?
Yeah, please.
So it was an interesting, I mean, it's such an important case, and to take what was a 58-year precedent since 1896, since Plessy versus Ferguson, of the separate but equal. And so it's such a clear, it's such a clear strategy of making this and particularly at the time, right? So you're after World War II, you've had integration of the military, you've had people coming back with the GI Bill, and this is the time when you can say like separate but equal is so flagrantly wrong and egregious, and nothing more than in education, where it is so important to get ahead, and particularly and so in this historical moment, like after the GI Bill, after, it's really clear that like this is, and more people are coming into the middle class, like after the Depression, after World War II, and this is their moment. And it really is compelling that they're using like school, like you have to take it down, and there's nothing more compelling than schools. And when you say something like, we conclude in the field of public education, after all of this, like education is so important, and it is, and it's the way you can't make people feel less than, and it's going to be important and to people's lives. So separate equal has no place. It's such a clear, like,
And to add, Barry, to what you were saying, one of our online students wrote that focus on K through 12 and education, kindergarten through 12th grade, and education is the basis of citizenship. Is really what
citizenship, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that without a robust K through 12 education, we do not have a well-informed and well-engaged citizenship. And to your point exactly, that the differences between white education and Black education meant that only part of our country was
Right.
really engaged as citizens.
And by the way, that's still, 54, that's still 10, 15 years or 10 years before the Civil Rights Act where, voting rights were given. And so anyway, so
Yeah.
it's just like you need an engaged citizen. I mean, and part of the problem now, is we don't have people. who are
Yeah,
well educated, so.
So I want to identify actually so another one of our online students noted that it seems that separate is inherently unequal, and that exactly, and that wasn't so. Barry, to pick up on what you were saying, the argument that it made in 1896 by the Supreme Court was that you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. So the train cars, you can have a white car and a black car, you can have a white school and a black school, et cetera, et cetera. It was really up and down in society. In the South, they were more than happy to take advantage of that ruling, and they separated everything. And what the Supreme Court decided strategically, the NAACP, which was the leading organization for civil rights for Black people, made the argument, and the Supreme Court agreed. Their strategy was not going to be that segregation is problematic because the Black institutions are always lesser than the white institutions. They were not going to do that because they did not want to give the segregated state the opportunity to start improving things. Their argument was that it is inherently unequal. And what is their reason for that? What do they spell it out? They don't now. The student here rightly pointed out that there are no specifics about this here, and I'll tell you one or two specifics in a moment. But what is the argument that they make in the ruling here about why separate is inherently unequal?
That was kind of the question I have. I mean, it seems quite intuitive, but basically, I guess the text is presented here is pretty much an assertion. It says we believe that it does. That it's. Was there anything? Obviously, the extent of the opinion is much more than this.
Yeah, and I'll fill in some of the gaps. Yeah, there was a choice between including a lot of words and flooding the page, and by the way, I would say generating the right questions. You should be close reading, and you should be asking always, like, is the evidence that I would need to buy this here? If you look at the second to last paragraph, they write to separate children in K through 12 schools from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race. Yeah, exactly. As Mark Stettler points out, generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. And here's where the Supreme Court put, and I took it out for brevity's sake, but here's where the Supreme Court actually put one of its most famous footnotes. Yeah, indeed, it is mental damage, is what they're referring to. That was actually derived from a psychological experiment that was done by a Columbia professor, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, in which correct, exactly, in which they took, this is very famous, it's for those who know it, we're engaged in hit Lamdut and think about, okay, what new can I learn? For others, what is the response of learning this anew? In any event, they went around to school-aged K through 12 children throughout the country, both Black and white, carrying two dolls. The dolls were identical in every single way except for the skin color. Every single aspect other than the skin color was the same. And they asked the kids a series of questions about these dolls. They said, which doll is smart, which doll is pretty, which doll is going to be successful, which doll do you want to play with, et cetera. And they asked all these sorts of questions, open questions like that. And what they expected to find, they did find, which is the white students would point to the white doll and say, that's the pretty doll, that's the smart doll, that's the doll that's going to be successful. What they didn't anticipate was that the Black students were going to answer the exact same way. They pointed at the white dolls and said, that is the pretty doll, that is the smart doll. And in several instances, kids pointed at them and they said, which doll do you look like? That several of the Black students pointed at the Black doll and said, that doll is an N-word, I am an N-word. And from that nationwide set of experiments that the Clarks did, they wrote several incredibly influential papers that described the mental damage that was being done as a result of segregation and discrimination in society. And the Supreme Court cited that as one of the key findings in their ruling. And so it's in this paragraph where they talked about its sense of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. They put that footnote there. And so if you're interested, I'd be happy to pass that on, both the studies and the rest of the ruling to everyone. Other thoughts about the ruling?
There is a previous case in Boston, Roberts versus Boston in 1850,
Yeah.
which is curious because on the one hand, I guess it was used to justify separate but equal and was cited in Plessy versus Ferguson. So the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Boston, but on the other hand, the state legislature banned segregation in the schools. So it was curious.
Yeah, Mark. So what Mark is raising a really, really interesting case. Exactly, it was out of Boston. Actually, the area that they're referring to there is interestingly is actually Beacon Hill today, one of the ritziest neighborhoods in all of Boston. Actually used to be a predominantly Black neighborhood, and so it was students there who thank you, Mark just put it in the chat. Roberts against Boston in 1850, and it was a group of students Black students who were segregated in the schools, and they sued. And as Mark rightly pointed out, they lost, and the judges said that the state has the right to segregate if they want, and that was cited in Plessy. Now, what's interesting about that case, and why most legal historians argue that it was inappropriate for the Plessy versus Ferguson court, the court that ruled that you could have separate but equal, that it was inappropriate for them to use that case as a citation. Is because it was a case ruled on prior to the 14th Amendment being put into the Constitution. The 14th Amendment that says no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the laws. And so most of these Supreme Court rulings in the 1950s and 60s, et cetera, that said that you cannot segregate are largely based on that. And I'll put it in the chat.
It's on page 9.
No state shall. Thank you. Yes. So, so if I can turn to page 9, rather than type it, you can all just look on page 9. Thank you, Barry. So on page 9 at the top. Oh, there it is. Thank you. The 14th Amendment requires that no state shall deny to any person equal protection of the law. So that becomes law of the land in 1868. And so the Roberts case that you're referring to, which, Mark, is a very interesting case, actually predates that. So the obligation of the state to provide equal protection was not yet in place. In any event, it is interesting that it does come out of Boston, and yet again, I think in many ways does get to Boston's complicated history around race. I wanted to just point out one more thing about this idea of generating a feeling of inferiority before we move on. And I'm going to put it into the chat because there's been a lot of psychological work done. And Barry and I contemplated for a bit whether or not we should really focus on this concept. The concept is called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is, it is a well-researched psychological phenomenon that people will live up or down to the stereotypes that are ascribed to them. It actually works both ways. That the people who are stereotyping others, who believe that Black people are, or that Asian people are, or that Jewish people are, will treat those people, whoever they have a stereotype about, in that way. That they will treat the people as if the stereotype they believe is real. And so if you believe that this person is not going to be good at math, you will generally not treat them. You treat them as if they're not good at math, etc. And it works for the victims of the stereotyping as well. That people who tend to be told by stereotype that you are not, you or people like you are not good at certain things, that you will then not do very well at those things. And so that's another example of the sense of inferiority that can be engendered in discriminatory settings like segregated schools. So there's that research was not available in 1954 when they wrote this ruling, but certainly is now. So the Supreme Court was right, basing their opinion in the Clark opinion and the Clark research, and there will be more research to be done later on that would further underscore this claim. about the inferiority of hearts and minds. All right, any other thoughts about Brown before we move on to a new? Indeed.
Just mention, in South Carolina, there was one black college called South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. After the Brown decision, in order to keep black people wanting to go to this black college, instead of trying to get into the white school, they built a brand new campus for the black students. When my partner, Charles McDew, arrived at South Carolina State as a freshman, he said it was unbelievable. It was brand new. Literally everything on the campus was brand new. The idea being, well, they don't really want to mix with us. We'll give them a nice place and they will be content to stay there. So even with Brown did not address the issue of colleges, but the white community reacted to it, not only in dealing with the lower grades, but also in the colleges.
So Barry is segueing us to, I think, the next thing I want to look at. So if we turn to page 6, the responses to Brown versus Board of Education in many ways were incredibly slow, and in many ways were incredibly swift. Yes, so there's a question in here, why did it take so long to implement Brown versus Board of Education is actually a perfect segue to what we're going to look at next. So the part that was slow, as Mark Stetner, one of our online students asks, the legal response to Brown to integrate the way Brown required took a long time, but what you're looking at on page 6 was swift. And so let's take a look at what's going on here on page 6. So if you look, I'll give you guys a few minutes to take a look at what you're seeing here. So take a look at the images, all 4 of them with their captions, and then just take any questions or comments or thoughts about what you're noticing here. So what are you noticing?
Well, if the state's gonna integrate schools, then people are gonna figure out a way, if you have money and privilege, to create schools that will allow them not to be integrated, and they'll be private, and they'll be Catholic also.
A lot of them were.
Here in Boston, yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, well, even, but most certainly in Boston, that is what happened.
Yeah. Mark Stetner, I just want to quickly point out, and I think he's pointing at something that's fascinating here. So it's maybe hard to read I'll read it to you. For those who are online, I've made it a little bigger here so you can read it a little bit more. But on the Citizens Council, for those who are not familiar with that name, basically the Citizens Councilors were the new Ku Klux Klan. That it was decided by really around the time of Brown versus Board of Education, that the KKK was a thing of the past. They were a little bit, over the top. They were not, polite society doesn't like a Klan. Polite society wants people in business suits, not hooded robes and things like that. We're going to do the same things the Klan did in terms of like keeping segregation and discrimination alive, but we're going to do it in a more respectable way. So they call themselves, instead of KKK, they call themselves
So 2016.
Citizens Councils. Yes, and
Citizens.
exactly. And so Mark pointed out, what does it read at the top? Dedicated to the maintenance of peace, good order, and domestic tranquility in our community and in our state, and to the preservation of our state's rights. And so those are, clarion calls of 1955, and in many ways, yes, of 2016. Yep.
Polite society got turnouts.
Yeah. Indeed. So what you have as a result of Brown versus Board of Education is very swift responses on the part of the South. And by the way, it is at that point that you start to see Confederate flags replacing old state flags throughout the South. It's after 1955 that happens. And the other swift response is to ensure that public schools would not be forcibly integrated, or that, so they just shut them. They shut them down in many cases. Many schools throughout Virginia were just shut down entirely, and in many other instances, they just opened up private schools, where hundreds of them that become known as segregation academies. Just this is clear. It's clear what they're doing, and they name themselves as such. Stonewall Jackson Academy, for example. This 1970 advertisement here. So very briefly, weigh in on it. You can move forward. Let's move forward. Okay, so what does this have to do with us? What does that do with Boston? Or what does that do with the Jewish community? So if we turn to page 7, first of all, what it has to do with Boston is that out of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, many cities throughout the rest of the country said it's good that you are naming segregation legal segregation, or in legal terms, de jure segregation, meaning in the law, segregation in the law. But let's be real. Segregation exists throughout the country. Thank you to redlining, all of our neighborhoods are segregated. And so we have segregated schools in Boston. We have segregated schools in New York, in Chicago, etc. And what are we going to do about that? And so the NAACP, their first move was really to try to push school boards to fix the problem on their own. And so here's an example on page 7, a letter sent by the NAACP to the school board that described the problem of what's called de facto segregation, meaning it's not segregation in the law, but it's segregation in fact. And schools throughout Boston were primarily, in most cases, 80, 85, 95, sometimes 100% white or black. And so, for example, here, if we read the top, what is de facto segregation? In most Roxbury and South End schoolrooms, there are no more than 2 or 3 white children. In many classrooms, all the children are Negro. Informed educators call this de facto school segregation. De facto means in fact. In the South, segregation is by law. In the North, it is not by law. But in fact, school segregation exists because most Negroes are forced to live in one section of the city. Okay, and so that leads to inferior education, and that's described here on page 8.
I just want to mention, when they're talking to the school committee at that time was elected. And it was viewed as the first step. If you want to be a more successful politician, you started out of the school committee and then would move to other jobs within the city, eventually to become the mayor, for example. One of the leaders of the anti-integration movement in Boston was a woman named Louise Day Hicks. And her slogan when she was running for the role of school committee and later for other offices, she would say, "You know where I stand." And everyone understood what she meant.
And what that looked like, where she stood was ensuring that descriptions like the ones on page 8 would continue. So Jonathan Kozol, who actually becomes one of the leaders, a thought leader, sociologist, who wrote quite a bit about segregation, the impact of segregation on communities, and wrote a beautiful book about the Boston segregation problems. He started out as a school teacher, described when he was a 4th grade school teacher, the room in which I taught my 4th grade was not a room at all, but the corner of an auditorium. The first time I approached that corner, I noticed only a huge torn stage curtain, a couple of broken windows, a badly listing blackboard, and about 35 bewildered looking children, most of whom were Negro. So way too many kids in dilapidated settings, not at all fit for learning. And again, when you talk about stereotype threat, the message that you are sending to kids here is that your education is not worth our money. And so that is what's going on throughout Boston schools. We're going to move forward because I really want to look at how this impacts the Jewish community. Just very quickly, at the bottom of the page, the NAACP does, shortly after the initial letter, they set out to Louis Day Hicks and the rest of the Boston School Committee their demands. And they include, way over the top suggestions like number 5, the assignment of permanent teachers to grades 1 to 3 and the reduction of these classes to 25. Again, Academy, if we had a class of 25 students, we would say that is way too big. We have to cut that in half. 25 is just an unreasonable number of students. 25 is what they're asking for here. So that's the sort of thing that they're asking for, hardly asking for much. And so it starts with teachers, and of course, number 11, an investigation into the reason why Boston has no Negro and not a single Negro principal. And of course, number 12, I think is vital here, getting back to this idea of stereotype threat, a review of the system of intelligence testing. And it's a different topic, but one that's well worth looking into is the ways in which IQ testing tests for certain things that can lead to racist outcomes. And there was a whole book that was written by Charles Murray, a Harvard professor, not too long ago, that cited all the ways in which white people score higher on the IQ test without taking into account the baked-in racist assumptions that are in the test. And so they were already thinking about that in number 12 as creating all sorts of problems of stereotype threat, that kids are called stupid because the IQ test says they are. Okay, now I want to take this a little further.
At the time.
Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. So what I'm going to ask everybody to do now, so you're going to need to look at, because I don't think I can make this big enough on my screen for everybody to see, but I'm going to invite everybody to open up their electronic versions of the text. And if you have it in front of you, turn to page 9. I'm going to ask you to read the middle column and the middle column here and the column on the right. So the middle column are how national Jewish organizations responded to Brown versus Board of Education, and then how they started responding in the 1960s once you had NAACP and other institutions pushing for desegregation in local community schools in New York, in Chicago, et cetera. So take a look at both responses, and I'd just love to hear your thoughts on the compare and contrast of those same groups responding one way in one instance and another way in a different.
I just want to mention in the right-hand column, the middle of the 3 things quoted begins by saying we regard the neighborhood school. That is racist language that instead of saying we want segregated schools, they say we want a neighborhood school because of racial segregation. By very definition, the neighborhood school will be a segregated school.
Yeah, Herman Capello, so Mark Stettner asked Herman Capello's comments, the director of the St. Louis Jewish Federation was in the 1960s. And it is possible that, it's right, I'm 100% sure because this is vital, the date of this, that I had it at some point, and I cut it off here. And I'm going to make a note, Mark, thank you for asking, to get the exact date on that. But yes, it would be from the 60s.
So it's interesting to see the theory versus practice and what people, how people respond when they think that,
Sure, it's nice to say nice things,
yeah,
very uplifting kinds of things, like the Conference of American Rabbis, wonderful. But what's really going on is the National Community Relations Advisory Council. That, if you read, no specific group has any special right, legal or otherwise, to enroll in any school, meaning you don't have the right to enroll in our segregated so-called neighborhood schools.
but what the Jewish community largely did in the 50s and the 60s is they left, they self-segregated themselves by moving to the suburbs, right? So they got to be
The
out of that,
well-to-do, let's look at the
Yeah.
Boston area.
just the, you know,
They didn't just move to Newton, they moved to Brighton, which was part of the city of Boston.
yeah,
And those children were going to be in segregated, were going to be, quote, integrated, whereas the kids in Newton would not, because
yeah.
they
in
didn't
Brookline
live
and Sharon and
that,
Milton. Yeah.
you know, the white flight that occurred when Brown versus Board of Education came, it had an immediate impact in Boston.
Yeah.
And so, you know, code words, neighborhood school
Yeah.
is one
And
of the code
you, by
words.
the way, you still hear that, you know, I mean, it's not like it's, and now the schools, you know, largely, you know, they're still segregated, right? It's not any, like, they're still segregated because white people who have privilege, you know, can send their kids, you know, live in the city of Boston, but send their kids to private schools. And again, you know, in my field, I hear this because people like live in JP until they don't, until second grade. You know, because the early childhood programs in Boston, which are integrated, are really good. But by second grade, you know, you hear them calling me to see if they can move to Newton.
Yeah.
So,
So, yeah, and I want to address actually, Barry, what you're talking about, and actually tie that to a couple of comments that were made, and I want to make sure that everybody in the class can read or hear them, and I'll actually reverse them in address them in reverse order. So, point two, which I'll read first, the American Jewish Congress acknowledges the positive importance of the Supreme Court decision, and in the right column, the same organization reflects the real feelings of the people. I think that it's, you know, I would wonder from that, for the person who wrote this, that, you know, is it that one is real and one is not real, or might it reflect two realities? And really, I think in many ways, and I think a lot about this in myself, you know, like you know, how often do I express support for something when it's distant, and then when it becomes a little closer to my world, am I a little more hesitant to express that? And you know, how do I live with both of those, or how can both of those possibly be true? And then how do I use Hitlamdut to elevate myself to a place where I can maybe start questioning some of the assumptions that I made and denial that I had when it got closer, and I started to not take the noble stand I once did. So I think those are some important questions, and I'm glad you pointed that out. And Mark, you raised a really interesting point about Rabbi Chiel, yes, there were indeed, I'm trying to get back to your, there it is. Didn't some American rabbis speak out more boldly to their congregations about discrimination? Was Rabbi Chiel one of them? And so yes, so Rabbi Chiel was a local rabbi in the Boston community, revered in many ways. And yes, he did speak out. There were many who did. And even some, by the way, in the South. There was, in fact, a wonderful book called the Temple Bombing, that really focused on Jack Rothschild, who was in Atlanta. There was a rabbi in Jackson, Mississippi, who actually housed freedom riders, and he got his house bombed for it. And so there were those who were very brave, and Rabbi Chiel certainly spoke out as well. And he actually took some heat, Rabbi Chiel, along with others, who said it's very easy for you to live in the suburbs. And speak out against it. And actually, we'll look at a judge in a second who took the same kind of heat. It's not in any way to say that Rabbi Chiel should be denigrated for his stance in favor of civil rights, etc. But there were those who said it would be easier for you if you lived in a city, harder for you if you lived in a city where your community was facing desegregation there. So,
but it also is just on, if you will, general principles that you have the word, one of our Mussar words is achrayut, and that means responsibility. And it's absolutely true that Rabbi Chiel lived in Newton, and he had a white congregation, all the rest of it. But he also had the responsibility to speak out that even if maybe one person in his congregation heard him say segregation is a bad idea, discrimination is a bad idea. If one person was affected by what he said, you can't dismiss the possibility that a leader in the community speaking out can have significant impact, even if we don't necessarily see it. And we have the responsibility to speak out, even if, you know, like you said, oh, well, we can have an opinion about the national situation and have a different opinion perhaps about the local situation, but we have a responsibility to look at the issues and really question ourselves whether we have a responsibility, what that responsibility is, and how we manifest that responsibility.
yeah. I think, Mark, that the AJC is lamenting that liberals have a misguided mandate approach to racism. Yes, I think that is what in fact they're saying. I want to be mindful of the time and take us to our final stage of today's class, and then let you know what we're doing next class, which I think in many ways is going to culminate our experience together. So if you turn to page 10, what this looked like in the Boston community in many ways was the move of Boston Jews out of Roxbury and Dorchester into the suburbs. And so, for example, Mishkan Tefillah, which the building, by the way, that they constructed in 1907 is still there today. I believe it's an Athenaeum. I'm not 100% sure. It has changed tenants a couple of times, but you can go visit it. And in fact, if people are interested in a tour of old Jewish Boston, there are actually a couple, and John Golden and I give one. So if you're interested in seeing the old haunts of Jewish Roxbury and Dorchester, we can definitely talk about that. And then they of course moved to Newton in 1958. Again, these dates should be familiar to you by now. And by the way, Mishkan still no longer exists as a congregation in that campus. They now exist in Brookline. Anyway, but that's just one example of a big synagogue, big community moving into the suburbs. And Maimonides School, of course, existed in Roxbury. And in 1962, again, they should be familiar with that area. They should be familiar. So they moved to the leafy suburb of Brookline. And then you have communities that were forming ex nihilo. Temple Amuna in Lexington was not moved from anywhere. They were founded in 1961 as that suburb, full of Jews who had moved from Roxbury and Dorchester, moved to the new suburb of Lexington that was made possible by Route 128, the new highway that ran as a belt around Boston. And in fact, actually a fascinating study was done about Route 28 that was called Route 128, the road to segregation, because it in fact is what led to more segregated communities. And if people are interested in that study, I'd be happy to pass that on to them. Communities like Lexington and Wellesley, et cetera, spring up in the 50s and 60s as 128 is built, and the Jewish communities are there from the start. And Amunah, Beth Elohim, et cetera. So all part of that stuff. It all culminates in many ways with the Supreme Court desperately trying to address de facto segregation in the North. And so this will be the last thing we look at together, and we'll talk about how this relates to Boston and again to the Jewish community again. So northern school districts, Boston, really throughout the country, were refusing to desegregate. They called them neighborhood schools. We don't have any obligation to desegregate, and we're not moving. And the Supreme Court said in an incredibly important decision in 1971, where a school in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina, where 14,000 Black students attended school, were either totally Black or more than 99% Black, they sued and they said, listen, we have tried really, really hard to get the schools to desegregate. The Supreme Court, but they're not, and they're not listening to the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and the Supreme Court ruled as follows. In a unanimous decision, bottom of page 11, the court held that once violations of previous mandates directed at desegregating schools had occurred, the scope of district court's equitable powers to remedy past wrongs were broad and flexible. Meaning that if the court had said, you need to get your butt in gear and desegregate, we can now step in, the courts can step in and force you to do certain things to desegregate. And one of them, number 4, no rigid guidelines can be established concerning busing of students to particular schools, meaning we are going to possibly use busing as a remedy for this situation. And that we're not going to establish guidelines as to when and how we do it. We will just do it. And so that happens throughout the country, and it happens in Boston. So quickly turning to page 12, and we're going to see again how this affects Boston and the Jewish community. This is for Bostonians, one of the most famous cases of all time, where the NAACP had managed to get not the city to pay attention to the racial discrimination that was going on in the city, but the state. And the state passed a Racial Imbalance Act in 1965 that basically said that if a school is imbalanced and has all white schools, all Black schools, et cetera, but they were by law now required to desegregate. But the Boston school was not. In 1972, parent Tallulah Morgan and 14 other parents of Black school children in Boston worked with the NAACP to file a lawsuit against the Boston School Committee President James Hennigan and other members for failure to comply with the Racial Imbalance Act. And the court stepped in and said, yep, you've been ordered to desegregate. You haven't done it. Now we are going to do it for you. And they ruled on page 13 that the Boston School Committee has knowingly carried out a systematic program of segregation affecting all the city's students, teachers, and school facilities. Neutral conduct is no longer constitutionally sufficient. And the judge ordered that students from the white South Boston schools be bused into the Roxbury schools, where it was overwhelmingly Black, and schools from the Roxbury schools be bused into South Boston. And they were done so with police escorts, with rocks thrown at them, with fights in the schools, and students standing in front of their schools with signs that look like this one at the bottom of 13.
I have a personal connection. I taught in one of the Boston inner city elementary schools for a few years around 2000. And one of the teachers, one of the African-American teachers at the school remembered when it was segregated. This is in the year 2000. She remembered when the school was segregated, like 30 years before.
And this school was now an integrated school? Or
So
had
the
it-
school, when I taught there, it was about 60% Black and 1/3 Vietnamese. There are a lot of Vietnamese who moved into Boston at the time. It's probably changed. And there were Hispanic, very few white students at the time. I also, I worked with international students in the spring, finding volunteer work, community service, and the Boys and Girls Clubs in South Boston were amenable. So I went to South Boston, I visited, and the neighborhood, as I wrote earlier in the chat, is now gentrified. So it's kind of a mixed neighborhood. But most of the kids are either Blacks or Hispanic, as far as I can tell, in that school where the Boys and Girls Club was located.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Barry pointed this out earlier as well, that what we're actually seeing trend-wise right now is schools are actually becoming in many ways more segregated now than they had been for a while. That it is, we are seeing, especially because of gentrification, we're seeing a lot of schools, rather than desegregating, becoming in fact actually more white or more Black, and that's an issue that we're really having to struggle with now. I want to
One point before you go ahead.
Yes.
Is, one attempt to integrate the inner city schools with the suburbs is a program called METCO. And it happens that Newton has more METCO students than any other school system in the state. That does not mean that the Newton schools are integrated. The number of Black students, for a while, they were only Black students until some parents, like Asian parents, who said, well, why should only Black children be given the opportunity to go to METCO, to go to Newton or the other surrounding communities. But it's a very small number of individuals who are handpicked by a committee rather than anybody can volunteer and anybody who wants to participate can participate. So it was an attempt to deal with the issue of residential segregation by making it possible for some children from the inner city to come to Newton schools.
Okay, I want to do one last thing together. I want to look something up very quickly so I can put it in the chat. And okay. There it is. Okay. And for those of you who are here in person, I will give you a link to this as well. So, okay, I will give you the link in a moment. I want to just do one last thing together. Because the question, what is the Boston busing crisis? And this was not the only place in the country in which there was a busing order from the court that you will integrate your schools via busing. It was happening actually nationwide. Boston, I think, really got more media attention because of it. But it was happening throughout the country. And one of the results of that was written about by Sarah Smith. And unfortunately, and actually this has a lot to do with what I think of my own achrayut, my own responsibility. This is the only study that's been done of this sort, and I think that we have to do a lot more work in this. But her study, Sarah Smith's study, looked at the impact of busing in the city of Los Angeles. And what she writes is, we're now on page 14. So before busing, there were 2 conservative elementary day schools in Los Angeles. After, there were 5. Before busing, there was one reform elementary day school in Los Angeles. After busing, there were two. The increased number of schools wasn't the only indicator that Jewish parents were fleeing the public school system to the day school system. Enrollments skyrocketed too. So you have Jewish day schools that are the beneficiary of it's a hard word to use, beneficiary, but certainly more and more what students who are in public schools are now going into private schools. Now, we have to be clear about this. This is not the reason there are Jewish day schools. Jewish day schools predate this by decades and have a lot to do with Jewish values, wanting to make sure that Jews have a Jewish education, etc. But the increase in the number of Jews who attended, Jewish kids who attend these schools skyrockets in the early 70s. And historians are beginning to ask, is this about busing? And if so, what sort of work, what sort of studies do we need to do to see if this Los Angeles situation is unique, or if this is something that is true throughout. But as she writes in the bottom part of the last part of the bottom paragraph on 14, between 1966 and 1980, the number of white students enrolled in Los Angeles public school system decreased by 269,000 students. That reduction was accompanied by a rise in the number of local private schools. Jewish students in Jewish schools were clearly identifiable participants in that change. And so this is a question that we all need to be thinking about. What does this mean to us? And so I just want to spend a moment before we close tonight's session, just love to hear some responses to that. Some thoughts about that.
Just curious, did the study, I assume that as part of the study, the parents at the time, or some representative sample of the parents at the time were interviewed as part of the study. What rationales did they provide?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question.
The reason I ask is because I think,
Yeah,
you know,
I can tell you. Yeah. Yeah.
because, I mean, obviously, one reason could be, parents can be stone cold racist and say, I don't want my precious little darlings going to school with people like that.
Right.
So it could, or there could be, so are these kids who are in, I assume after school, Hebrew schools who were prevalent back then.
Yep.
So, parent concerned about their kids' Jewish education, if they're not going to be able to, what is, being bussed across LA? LA is a pretty big place.
Yeah.
That's that has a, I don't know what I would do in that circumstance, but in terms of it wouldn't necessarily have to do with, that would be very altruistic of me, to do that. Realistically, if me in 1970 with my kids, however I felt, that's, I'm not.
You wouldn't say, I don't want my children to go to school with Black children. You
No.
would say, I want my children to get a good Jewish education.
I wouldn't just say it.
Mhm.
I'd mean it.
Yeah.
No, no, that is true.
Yeah.
But the impetus for you to make that decision was very clearly, and obviously this didn't affect you directly, but the impetus for that decision was about desegregation of the schools. It was, sure, you want your kids to get a good Jewish education.
Yeah.
But if it wasn't for the desegregation of the schools, your kid would have, I don't know you personally, your child would have gone to the after-school program, because just look at the numbers. So there was one, then there's two, then there's three. Just say there were five. Right. Before busing, there were two conservative elementary day schools. After busing, there were five.
Oh.
that is not all of a sudden all these people realizing their Jewish roots.
Granted that.
Yeah.
It is, and so it is a legitimate issue.
So I'll point everybody in a direction, and again, I can give the folks here in the live studio audience this link as well, but I put it in the chat too, that there's a podcast called White Nice Parents. That came out about, I don't know, 2 years ago, and it's a fascinating story about a group of parents who got together to desegregate their local public school. We have in Brooklyn. Yeah, and they were all in favor of making this, an integrated neighborhood where their kids could go to school together. And then when they did it, when it actually happened, most of those parents end up taking their kids and sending them to private schools or to other public schools when they were available. And so they interviewed, they went back and interviewed these parents and asked them exactly the question. And the vast majority of them said a lot of what that the bus ride is too long. It's not fair to my kid. They have so much to do, and to spend hours on the bus is not okay. The educational level that we hoped would be achieved in the newly integrated school was not anywhere near we hoped it would be. And so it's not fair to our kid to put them in that situation, et cetera. And it's hard to argue that. It's hard to argue that. It is. Now, to be fair, they press a little bit and they ask, and and maybe there were other things that might have been going on as well, but it's well worth listening to. White Nice Parents. It really gets at that. Yeah. So really, I think about stories like this on two levels. One, there's the Hitlam Dut position, is how am I responding when I'm hearing this story? Am I feeling, am I feeling defensive? Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling, paralyzed by guilt or shame? And if so, how can I move myself into a space of achrayut? And what does it mean to take on a stance of achrayut, a stance of responsibility? And what is my responsibility to this? I did not choose to send my kids to private school in 1970 after having sent them to public school as a result of busing. I didn't do that. I didn't create that. And yet, I'm a teacher in a predominantly affluent, almost entirely white suburban Jewish high school. Do I have responsibility, given this history, to make changes, to be anti-racist in that particular space? I think the answer is absolutely yes. And then the question is, what does that mean to do that? To say, I may not be to blame for this, but I do have responsibility here. And what does that look like? Yeah, and I think Mark asks a great question. Is it hypocritical to fight for justice and send your kids to a private school if the environment is safer with smaller classes with higher educational standards? We have to ask ourselves that question.
There are people who would say the answer is, if we went back to page 9, the top one on the right-hand column, even the liberals are attracted by the proposition that education can be separate and equal, and all that is required is the upgrading of slum schools. So let's take the word slum out of there. But to say, if in fact we all live in white neighborhoods, which are segregated, we then have a responsibility to the schools that are located in other neighborhoods, and to use our education, our influence, etc., to make sure that the other schools can be as good as they can be. And that requires a lot more work on our part. How do you see that all the schools in the greater Boston area are meeting the kinds of standards that are expected in the suburban schools? And one of the things that is happening, we haven't touched on this, which is that almost every major city in the United States is now segregated. on the basis of race, that the white people have moved out and the inner cities are now very heavily Black, Hispanic, Asian, but not white. And one of the things that happens is that those institutions in those schools are being starved of resources. They don't get the same money, the same quality teachers, the same nice buildings, etc., that you have in the suburbs. And so we have to figure out a way that we can do everything that we can to improve the schools. And part of that has to do with money. How much money the inner city schools have compared to how much money the suburban schools have.
That's part of that structural thing where schools are, funded based on local property taxes.
Right.
So,
And for example, in the city of Boston, more than half the property is non-taxed because it either belongs to a religious institution or to an academic institution. And so we think, oh, it's great, look at all these colleges, then that's has a certain benefit in terms of the amount of money that these kids bring into the community, but it also has a very, very serious negative effect on how much money is available for city services. And schools are asked to make donations in lieu of taxes. Oh, okay, I'll give you $10,000. How much money does Harvard, which owns half of Cambridge, not just the institutional buildings, but they own an incredible amount of residential real estate. How much money do they owe to the city of Cambridge? How much money does Boston University, Northeastern University, Emerson College, Suffolk University, how much do those institutions owe to the city of Boston? And the answer is they owe a lot and they pay almost nothing. And so
there's actually a new initiative, or it's coming before, I don't know if it's going to be a referendum, but that in Suffolk County, there be a 2% sales tax on any residential real estate that gets sold. So it'll be interesting because
what
it'll
will
be
that
similar.
money be specifically?
Yeah, no, it's for the
allocated
city,
for
it's for the
education?
city of, it's for city and local governments. So for Suffolk County, that would be Boston.
In Boston, right?
Yeah.
And that would be an interesting initiative to support, because that would be another way to fund.
So we are at the end of our class today, and I'm rather than reading the essay that I had hoped we'd have time to read, I'm going to actually ask the folks to read it for homework. And so I want to actually set this up because this is a tough one here. In many neighborhoods, whites and blacks did live together. Harlem is a famous example of that. And the relationship between white Jews and non-Jewish blacks was oftentimes complicated. And several of the participants in our class have asked me about that. And I think it's really, really important that we delve into that. There are many essays that we can read, although I think none are as penetrating and as important as the one that was written by James Baldwin in 1967. And so on page 17, you have an excerpted copy. If you want the full version of it, it's well worth reading, but I think the excerpted version will also suffice. Anyway, I put into the chat the Baldwin essay, okay. It's in the chat, so you can go back and see it. If you want to get the whole thing, otherwise, read the excerpt here. The essay is called "Negroes Are Anti-Semitic Because They're Anti-White," and I want to just say that the title itself feels hard. And I want everybody to be thinking about how the title makes you feel, and then as you read the rest of it, how it makes you feel. Certainly, I want you to be thinking about what is James Baldwin trying to do here? Who is his audience? What is he trying to say? And indeed, as Mark Stettner points out, Colin Powell grew up in New York City and very fondly talked in Yiddish about about the Jews that he grew up with and had many fond memories. Baldwin has a bit more of a pointed memory of that, and I think that it's important for us to hear what he has to say. So taking a stance at Hitler, read the essay, and we'll talk about that. And because in our class next week, we're really going to be talking about listening to stories that are hard to hear. I think that in being a good anti-racist, taking a stance at Hitler, that is one of the most important things we can do. So we'll start with James Baldwin next week. All right. Have a good rest of your night, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Not good luck.
Oh, yeah, I was about to see you.
And a Shana Tova, yes.
Indeed.